This seller has sold over $250,000 on Etsy using print on demand. Print on demand is a process where you create the products and post them for sale on Etsy, and then once they're actually ordered from your customers, a company like Printify will print them and ship them all for you. And Daniel has done that completely while working part-time and living in the UK, but selling mostly to the United States. So this is going to be a value-packed video, especially if you don't live in the US, since I know more than 50% of my audience doesn't. So I hope you'll enjoy this interview with Daniel, and let's go say hello. Hello, Daniel. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm so excited to share your Etsy and print on demand journey today. So thank you for being here.
Cassie, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot for having me. Been a long time viewer of your videos as well. And yeah, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today.
Perfect. Well, let's dive right in because I know everyone wants to know the dirty details. How did you get started in print on demand?
Absolutely. Thanks, Cassie. So I think just to take a step back, I've always had I've been in business for a long time now. So I actually did a bachelor's degree in business randomly in South Carolina, even though I'm originally from the UK. And then I did a master's degree at St Andrews in Scotland, also in business. And since then, I've worked at different companies around the world. I worked at a consulting company in management consulting. And most recently, I've worked specifically in learning and development. So I've worked around training employees at different tech companies in the UK and also in the US.
Makes sense why you started a YouTube channel.
It is, exactly, yeah. So that's exactly the reason why I really wanted to kind of merge my interests for, teaching, but also my interest and passion for Etsy print on demand as well. Yeah, so essentially, I've always loved what I do in terms of working in the business world and learning and development. But I've always had this little bit of a entrepreneurial thing going on where I've always wanted to start something for myself and try to build something up for myself. But I've always been a little bit complacent about it and always kind of wasn't sure what to do, where to start. And then good old COVID hit. And us here in the UK, we went into massive lockdowns where we basically weren't allowed to leave our houses. It was pretty depressing. And I decided that was a great opportunity to dive headfirst into the world of Etsy and print on demand specifically. So I launched my first Etsy print on demand store in the middle of 2021. And basically now I've been doing it for about 2.5 years to date and have really enjoyed the journey so far. And I'm really looking forward to growing it even more as I continue my journey now.
Yeah, I love to hear that. It's unfortunate to hear that you guys had such harsh lockdowns, but sometimes that's where some of the best things in life are born, or in the hard times, right? Because you wouldn't be here today talking about your successful business if you hadn't been stuck at home. So sometimes good can come out of it. So tell us a little bit about starting your business then. How did those first few months go? Because I know a lot of people get really discouraged in that time. It takes some people a long time to get their first sale. It takes some people a couple of days to get their first sale. What did that beginning process look like for you? And what was your mindset going into it?
Absolutely. Yeah, great question. So I think first and foremost, I wanted this, to be a little bit of a side hustle, I guess. I wanted to continue with my regular job. But I thought to myself before I started this, if I do want to start this, I'm going to treat this like an actual business, right? I'm going to really put my business hat on and I'm going to treat it as if I was starting a startup or wanting to start the next Facebook, for example. So applying similar strategies that other businesses do to my Etsy store itself. And what I saw, so it took me about maybe 2 or 3 weeks for me to get my first sale. And then I had reached 900 sales by the end of my first year. So by the end of 2021, and that translated to approximately $40,000 in revenue. So profit margin was about 25% at the time. So you can do the math there. So it was about $10,000 in take-home profit in the end of my first year.
Wow, I love to hear that. And so just to give people an idea, what kind of time were you putting into doing that? And, how many listings did you do a day? What did that look like work-wise on your end?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I was lucky or fortunate enough to be able to continue my my regular job during COVID. So I was working remotely full time still, but then I would usually spend in those first couple of months in 2021, I spent between 1 to 2 hours a day, I would say, really working on the branding of my store and uploading listings. So I would say within about 3 months, I had approximately 100 listings up, I think. Then essentially I continued on that pattern. So with this approximately 1 to 2 hours on a daily basis in the evenings, where I would then continue to, ramp up the store, focus on customer service as well, making sure that all of the parts of this business of mine were slotting into place.
Yeah, it's a lot of work in the beginning. I think when you're first getting started, you're really optimistic and you have all these ideas of how glamorous and how easy and wonderful it'll be. But then you have to learn how to market. You have to learn how to make mock-ups. You have to learn how to do SEO, learn how to design. There's a lot of skills that you didn't even know you needed that all of a sudden you really need to learn. What would you say were some of the biggest obstacles for you in getting started? What were some of the harder things that you had to learn?
Great question. I think first and foremost was quite typically that I wasn't too familiar with Etsy or print-on-demand suppliers or platforms such as Printify or Printful. So there was a big learning curve for me to understand exactly how those different platforms operate, how they work. Another big one for me, because I didn't really come from the internet space myself, was all around how do I go about optimizing my listings. So learning about SEO, search engine optimization, was something that I spent a lot of time on YouTube as well myself, learning about the ins and outs of, how to really perfect that. And I'd really encourage anyone else to, really focus on those as well. And I think very last thing is that one thing you need to know about Etsy in comparison to other platforms is that it's a very community-driven platform. I feel like. So shoppers or buyers typically come to Etsy to want to purchase and support, local smaller businesses. And it really shows. And I quickly realized that when I started, speaking with different customers of mine, and they were reaching out to me personally to thank me and, making repeat orders in the future. So, one big learning was to really focus on building those customer relationships, because it can really pay off for you in the future.
I think that's a great takeaway. That leads to good reviews. Hopefully they recommend other people. I think that's a really great takeaway. And, I think a lot of people really wonder, and this is the question I get asked a lot, did you go with a niche store where you had just one niche that you scaled out in your store? Or did you go like I did with a general store and sell lots of different niches? What did that kind of look like? And has that evolved at all since you got started?
Great question. So I took a little bit of a different approach, I guess, to the typical niche or general store approach. I did start more in a niche direction, but then started to apply different aspects of other types of stores into that niche itself. So, for example, I took a specific niche that I operated in and then focused on, for example, different designs, different trends, different sub niches within that niche as well, to then have a look at kind of branching out within this specific niche. I actually just released a video recently which is based on a framework that I created called a mix and match framework. And the idea is that you can create your own niche or business idea based on mixing and matching different ideas. There's a lot to it. I'm not going to talk about it here, but so in a nutshell, more in the niche direction is what I went for.
No, that makes tons of sense. And I'll link Daniel's channel down in the description. I definitely would recommend checking out his channel once you're done with this video if you enjoy it. And so then let's kind of come towards the future. So, we know you sold like 40K revenue in your first few months on Etsy in 2021. What has that journey looked like up to date then? So 2022 and 2023 now.
Yeah, absolutely. So up till now, so as of end of 2023, I've made around $250,000 in sales overall. This is based on the main kind of Etsy store that I have. I also have kind of a complementary second store. I kind of live side by side next to it as well. But overall, about $250,000 in sales. Another thing to note is, of course, this is running it kind of as a side income business. I've always still had my full-time business. I actually recently just quit that job, and now I've decided to focus a little bit more time on Etsy to hopefully be able to, ramp this up a little bit more, as well as obviously the YouTube things that I'm getting into a little bit more now.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think, only having an hour or two a day put into this business and building up to 250K in revenue is amazing. I mean, when it comes to side hustles, I mean, if you kept that same 25% profit margin, I mean, you've made what, 50, 60, 70 grand, somewhere in that range in the 2.5 years you've been doing it. I mean, that's really not bad for just a couple hours a week of putting your time in. So just imagine how much that will amplify once you can do it a little bit more full time, put more of your time and focus in. And just to get an idea of what that has looked like, if you could give me a range then of about how many listings you've had to make to get those sales, I'd be interested to hear it, because I think a lot of people start this and they do 20 or 30 or 60 listings and they're like, well, I tried my hardest and it didn't work. And I just don't think that's quite enough, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, isn't it? And I mean, I've seen a lot of sellers on Etsy that really have succeeded with a comparably small amount of listings. I myself, so by the end of that first year, so end of 2021, I had approximately 200, a bit more than 200 listings up, I think. And then now at the moment, I have approximately 600 listings up. So I definitely, since the end of 2021, kind of slowed down a little bit. That was kind of just personal preferences, also the time commitment that I had available to me. But overall, I would say I have about 600 listings up. And I would say the majority of the sales probably come from about 20% of those listings, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's what I hear from a lot of people. I found that in my own shop as well. So while it's not about quantity, right? It's about quality. I think you still, especially in the beginning when you're just learning how everything works, I think quantity is somewhat important. The chances of you starting this business and being super, super good at it the second you try it is really unlikely. It's just like riding a bike, right? You weren't great at it the very first time you tried it. And so I think it sounds like you're the same as most other people. You have to try different ways to cross knees, try different ways to make designs, try different trends. And then when you find what works, I'm assuming you doubled down on it and did a lot more of what worked. So why don't you talk us through maybe just a couple of things? What do you think that you did so well with your listings or your store to find your success? Did you do free shipping or paid shipping? Was it the way that you niched down? What do you think were some of the things that led to your success?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned earlier, what I think really helped me was that I really treated this like a business from day one. So as a brand, so I put a lot of focus on creating a cohesive brand structure around all of my listings and also my store, right? So that is simple things like branding around your logo, your header, making sure that you have a consistent brand language, how you're dealing with customer service issues, that everything is consistent and really depicts your brand as a business. I also did, before I actually dove into this at all, I did a little bit of like a target market analysis, I guess. So I really dove into, okay, what are some potential business ideas that I have or product ideas? Who are the individuals that would actually potentially be interested in buying these items, right? So let's have a think. Maybe it is middle-aged men based in the Southeast in the US, right? As an example, what are the specific interests that they maybe have? What are specific kind of pain points or challenges that they're facing that we could actually focus on with these products that we're developing for them? and then actually building your brand around these different items so that you're essentially targeting or catering to a specific market. I think those are, it sounds a bit vague, but that's essentially what I think helped me a lot in terms of really being able to tick a lot of boxes for a lot of potential buyers.
Yeah, I
Does that
think
make
that makes
sense?
a ton of sense. I think the research piece of your business is the most underrated when it comes to print on demand. And so I think doing your research is super important. So let me ask you this then. When it comes to researching, what kind of research did you do to ensure that the niche that you picked had demand? Did you make sure there was other stores selling similar products, that there were other items that were best sellers, or how did you make sure that this would be a profitable enough niche to support you in making a whole store around that?
Yeah. So one of the thing, or the way I came up with my initial idea for these designs that I had in my mind was actually based on different products that were very, very popular in other geographic locations, but not necessarily in the US per se. So these specific items were very similar items to them were very, very popular in Europe, in the UK. And so I thought, maybe there might be some demand for these in other markets around the world as well. And so I took that idea, still an idea in my head, and then turned to Etsy. I started doing general research just simply by scrolling through Etsy, seeing what else was out there. So similar products, what could be competing with this. I also used the tool Everbee. So I used eRank back in the day. Now I use the tool Everbee to really, really help with understanding, different keywords that may be in high demand versus somewhat low competition, to really help me to narrow down and hone in on a specific, sub niche, which, could prove lucrative to me. And yeah, I think those are kind of the main things that I focused on doing, especially in the beginning stages. And I still do now, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that research makes a ton of sense. I use a really similar model with making all of my designs. Even though I have more of a general store, what it looks like for me is I try and find trends or ways to niche down. And then when I find a different niche that doesn't have that trend or that combined niches idea, I add those to that one to add value. And so I think that's a really great way to really find success, is you don't have to make everything up, right? A lot of creativity is just finding new ways to combine ideas that are already there. So I love to hear how you did that. I think that really speaks a lot to why you found the success that you have, because again, like you said, you've treated it like a business. You've been analytical in the way that you've gone into it and very intentional. And I think in doing those things, anyone can find similar success, right? See what's already selling and try and find new ways to combine it to add your own value is really important. I think a lot of the people that don't end up succeeding on this platform just copy exactly what other people are doing and don't add their own value. So I'm glad to hear that you do it that way. So I know that there's not as many YouTubers or people on YouTube in general talking about what it's like living outside of the US, selling to the US. So I'd love to move the conversation over that direction a little bit. So I'd love to know, where do you sell your print-on-demand products? Do you sell just to the US? Do you sell to the UK and all countries? What does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So my primary target market, speaking of target markets, is the US. So I would say that probably 95% of my sales are all to the US market. That being said, I do still allow, or I do make my products visible in the UK and in Europe as well. But they just make up a much smaller proportion of my sales overall. So again, they make up about 5% of my sales that I see on a yearly basis. So that's why I do focus very heavily on the US market with my products, but they are still available to the the individuals in my country here in the UK and also in Europe as well.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And so I think that, a lot of people who live outside of the US have some trouble figuring out how to price their items. So how has that been with pricing your products for the conversion to USD? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I have actually throughout my journey had quite a bit of back and forth around the best way to approach specifically the currency side of things. A couple of things to mention around the currency in your Etsy account. So you will generally always have a payment account currency. So that is essentially, if you go on the payment account section in your Etsy tab, you'll then see essentially the revenue that's going to be transferred over to your bank account. The currency of that will typically always be in the same currency as your bank account. So for me, for example, I have a UK bank account in pounds, meaning that the values that show in there are in pounds as well. Now you can also then, or you do also have a store currency, and that is the currency that you see all of your stats, your revenue data in your store itself. You can set that theoretically to whatever you want it to be. So for example, I could have that set in dollars, for example, but there's a couple of reasons why I think that you should always have it set in the same currency as your own. So I have mine set in pounds as well. Number one reason is that Etsy will charge a 2.5% conversion fee if they need to convert it from a different currency into your payment account currency. So for example, when I first began, I had it set up in dollars in my store currency. But what I quickly found out is that Etsy was actually charging me 2.5% when it was moving that cash into my payment account. So that was 2.5% just out of the window for no particular reason. Second reason why I'm a big fan of just keeping it in your own currency, when a potential buyer goes onto their Etsy store, they will always see your products in their preferred currency. So for example, if you're based in Ohio, for example, and you are just going into Etsy from Ohio, they'll typically see your listings in dollars, regardless of if your store currency is set as pounds. So at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter from your perspective. They will always see it in their preferred currency. So from my perspective, I think making sure that you're keeping that standardized in your own currency can go a long way to saving you money and avoiding headaches down the road.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I didn't know that that was an automatic process, that Etsy would only show you things in your own currency. That seems really great. So I think you just probably saved a lot of people a lot of money thinking that they had to have their account in USD for it to show USD to the customers. So I think that was a really, really valuable tip there to save people 2.5%. I mean, that is a huge percentage considering you've sold $250,000 on Etsy. That can really, really add up. But I know that people from the UK and Europe, I'm not sure exactly how far it spreads, probably have questions about potentially other fees like VAT fees. Do you need to, and for anyone who doesn't know what those are, which I barely know what they are either, let's be honest, is there something called a value added tax? Is that what it's called, Daniel?
Yeah, that's it.
And that is a charge for just people, I believe, in Europe, or is it just the UK? Who has VAT taxes?
So it's primarily Europe, so the EU and the UK also has it, exactly right. And exactly as you said, so it's essentially value-added tax. I would say the equivalent of it is probably sales tax in the US. In Australia and New Zealand, I believe it's GST is the equivalent of it as well. And essentially, it's a sales tax. So it's a tax that's applied to most goods and services that are sold. And there's a lot to talk about when it comes to VAT. I could probably sit here and talk about it for hours and hours on end. I'm not going to do that. Don't want to bore people. But in general, what you need to keep in mind is that in the UK specifically, you can either be VAT registered or not VAT registered. Now, you have to register for VAT if you earn more than £85,000 per financial year. So that converts to about $110,000, I would say. If you earn above that, you need to register for VAT, and it means that you are then subject to paying VAT on every single purchase or every single sale that you make. If you're below that £85,000 threshold or $110,000, you don't need to register for VAT. So what that means is that you don't have to charge VAT on every single one of your sale if you're selling to the States, but you are still subject to VAT on the Etsy fees.
Oh.
So yeah, it's quite complicated, and I'm by no means a financial advisor. So, but from my understanding, again, I would definitely recommend, keeping that non-VAT registered status as long as you can, and to then focus on, making sure that you're continuing to obviously pay your VAT fees on the Etsy fees, and that happens automatically.
Oh.
So once a sale goes through, if you then go to your payment account, you'll then see, all of the normal Etsy fees are, subtracted from your balance, but then you'll also see the VAT fees subtracted on top of that as well. And that's 20% of all of the fees. So in essence, in the UK, you're essentially paying 20% more on top of the fees that you usually would be with Etsy. Does that make sense? It's a difficult subject.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it happens automatically. I think that's very, very convenient. So I guess just for clarification, just for anyone listening, if you don't live in the UK or the EU, it sounds like this does not apply to you. This is just if you live in that place, this is when you're the ones that have to worry about it. And so just for, clarification, when you're talking about the, £80,000 minimum, is that in revenue or in profit?
That's in revenue. £85,000 in revenue per financial year. So in the UK, I believe that's from April to April is the financial year here. And yeah, exactly. So it's 85K in revenue.
Okay, perfect. So then how do you compete on sales prices and still get a decent margin then? Because I'm assuming you have to charge VAT now, since it sounds like you've done that in a financial year.
So I'm actually personally just below that. So I'm actually been just below that 85. So that again calculates to about $110,000. And I'm just below that. So I've not had to register for VAT yet. So at the moment, whenever I do sell a product in the US, I am not charging VAT, and VAT does not get charged to my customer in any kind of way. The only VAT fees that I worry about are the ones that come from the Etsy fees that are charged to me, and the VAT that gets added onto that. Now, if you are someone that has to, so let's say you go above that £85,000 threshold and you register for VAT, then I believe, there's a lot of different ways to go about this, but essentially you have two methods. You can either keep your prices consistent, and that way, obviously, you're just eating into your profit margins, right? The VAT has to come from somewhere. Or you can have a look at reallocating that VAT into your costs, so into your sales price as well. Obviously, what that means is you would have to raise your prices, but that is something that you would have to obviously take into account. I would say if you are in that situation where you're kind of reaching that threshold and you have to look at potentially registering for VAT, is to first and foremost speak to an accountant or financial advisor about it to understand what the best options for you are. And then secondly, to really conduct a pricing analysis to really understand, what the actual cost burden will actually be for you if you weren't to change your prices at all versus if you were to increase them by X percent, so by 10%, 20%, however much, to really understand, where you can go with this to really make sure that it's still a profitable venture for you.
I think that's great advice. And I think every 6 months to a year, it's a great idea to do some competitor analysis for your pricing anyways. The amount of difference there's been just in the last 4 years while I've been on Etsy is really, really different. What I saw working for doing your pricing 4 years ago when I started versus what most top sellers are doing today are very different. So I do think that if you're not even having to pay VAT fees, or if you are, that's a really valuable experience to go through. Maybe finding 10 to 20 really successful, more recently opened stores and seeing how they're pricing their items and how much profit you would make per item if you sold at their sales prices, I think would be a really, really valuable process to go through. That's something that I teach in my course. So you know exactly how to do that in a really efficient way. And I think that's a very valuable thing to do when you first start your shop. And, again, if you have to do VAT or every 6 months to a year, just to make sure that you're being priced competitively. So I think that's great advice. And I've gotten some questions from some folks in my course that are in the UK, and they asked if you reclaim any of the VAT that you're charged or not.
Yeah, so if you're not a VAT registered business, you generally can't reclaim any of your VAT fees. So that VAT that I do pay on the Etsy fees, you can't reclaim that if you're not VAT registered. If you are VAT registered, you can reclaim the fees, the VAT on the fees, but you're still paying the VAT for the products that you've sold. That makes sense.
I see. So you have to reclaim just a small portion of it. It's just the, say, 20% of the Etsy fees, which is much smaller than the actual sales price. So you can get some of it back.
Exactly. You would get some of it back. You get basically back the VAT that gets charged on the fees that you have to pay, but you don't get the VAT back on the sale that you're making if you're VAT registered. If you're not VAT registered, which will likely be the majority of people, I'm guessing, because you're under that 85% threshold, then it's not something you typically have to worry about. And reclaiming VAT is not typically something you can do either. I believe the second part of your question was whether I'm voluntarily registered for VAT. That is something, just to add to this massive headache that is VAT. You can, if you want to, even if you're under that £85,000 threshold, you can still register for VAT voluntarily. Again, I would conduct an analysis. It really depends on your personal situation and your personal financial setup. For me personally, it didn't make financial sense to register for VAT voluntarily. It made more financial sense for me to actually retain this non-registered format, I guess, or status in terms of my bottom line. So I'm not registered voluntarily. Again, it's a personal decision though. So I'd really recommend, if you are considering it, to conduct a bit of an analysis of your own financial situation first.
No, and I think it's good advice to talk to an accountant or a CPA of some kind, because everyone's situation is different. And speaking of that, I know I did also get a question on how your business is set up. Are you set up as an LLC, a sole proprietorship? Are you registered in the US? What did that end up looking like for you?
Yeah, so in the UK, the equivalent of sole proprietorship is called sole trader. It's, I think, on essentially more or less the same thing. So I've set up as a sole trader. So I've not registered this as a business per se. I've kept it as a sole tradership that I have. I mean, a couple of different reasons for this. Probably the main one for me for the time being, because up until now it was really, a bit more of a side income stream for me, was simply the simplicity of it and the fact that there wasn't as much paperwork. It was less of a headache for me. And I realized that it wasn't really going to have a massive impact on my financial bottom line, whether I changed this to an LLC or, a UK company per se. So I've registered as a sole trader. I think one important piece of advice, if you are based in the UK, even if you are a sole trader, you still have to complete a self-assessment tax return at the end of the financial year as well. So be sure to look into that, because you don't want to have the HMRC, which is our equivalent of the IRS. You don't want to have them knocking on your door anytime soon.
I appreciate you knowing the lingo for both countries so you can translate it for me. I'm sure it helps a little bit to have studied abroad and have an American wife, so you can learn the lingo from both places, because it's very convenient. I would not have known what you meant by, was it HMRC?
HMRC, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. There's a lot of weird lingo over here, so I always like to translate it.
I really appreciate the exact talk about, selling from the UK to the US, but 50% of my YouTube channel is actually not from the US. So let's talk a little bit about just what it's like selling from somewhere not in the US to the US. How has that been, making sure that your listings can still rank? Do you think it's just the same as if I were to list a listing, or do you feel like you have to do anything different? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm just speaking from personal experience here, in that it hasn't really had a massive impact on me, I don't think. I've still seen quite a bit of success. I would say one piece of advice is that, similar to your currency, you can also have two different location settings, I guess, in your Etsy store. So you'll generally always have your store location, which should always be the location of where you're based. So I have mine set as the UK. But what you can do, and you should do, is in your shipping profiles that you set up, is you can decide to specify where your products are actually shipping from. So I'm using Printify. I actually use Swift POD for a lot of my products. I believe they're based in San Diego, if I remember correctly. But regardless of, I have it set up from that area where Swift POD ships out from. So what I found is that a lot of the times, potential buyers, when they're actually filtering for products, they're less likely perhaps to filter for shop location rather than, how long will it actually take to reach me here in the US. So from my personal experience, again, I can't speak for others, but I don't think it's had a massive impact on me, seeing as 90 to 95% of my customer base is US focused, and I've not in any way hidden the fact that I'm based in the UK. Quite the contrary, but I do make sure and very crystal clear that the products do ship from the US. So I'd focus on making sure that your shipping locations and your store locations are both accurate.
No, and I think Etsy really, really needs you to be honest about where you're located, especially when you create your store. Even if you're going to be only selling to the US, you do need to be honest about where you're located, because I have heard of stores that try and lie about where they're located and get suspended. So definitely be honest with Etsy on where you are actually located, where your business is located, and then where it's getting shipped from. If you use Swift POD like Daniel does, or Monster Digital like I usually do, you just need to Google where those places are located, and you can find that shipping information to add into your shipping profiles, and you'll be able to find that just fine. So I think that is really good to hear, that if you just make really good listings that are in demand for searches that people are searching for, that it doesn't really seem to have any bearing on how they get listed. That's kind of what I had probably assumed, but it's good to hear. I think when you're first starting a business, it's just easy to worry about all the what ifs and the little issues. And, when you're seeing everyone on YouTube living in the US, it's hard to really see what it's like for someone like you. So I appreciate you coming on and answering these questions. And so my last question to you, Daniel, and I appreciate you going so in depth on all of this, because it's been really, really valuable. Do you have any other advice to sellers that don't live in the US that want to sell to the US that might help them on their journey?
Yeah. Ooh, where do I start, Cassie? I would say two things, probably. I think first and foremost, it's a bit of a boring answer, but it's so important. And that is that depending on where you're based, you typically always have to abide by the business laws of the country that you actually reside in. So I'm based in the UK. That means that I always need to abide by the business and corporate laws that the UK businesses are subjected to over here. And that's more or less, I know that's the same in the EU, so in Europe as well. And it's regardless of where your customer base actually is. Now, I could go on and on about, EU and British business laws, but in a nutshell, what it typically means is that British and EU consumers typically have a bit more in terms of consumer rights, consumer protections. So it's definitely worth investing some time into better understanding what those business laws actually look like in your country, because it's very likely that you may actually be subjected to them yourself, regardless of where you're selling. So that's number one. Number two, and it kind of goes back to what I was talking about right at the beginning, and that's around creating a brand for yourself. is to really, from the beginning, assess and analyze and gain a really good understanding about who your target audience actually is. And this doesn't only go for, individuals abroad trying to sell into the US, it goes the other way around as well, right? You could be based in the US trying to sell into the UK, for example. So gain a really good understanding of who you're actually trying to sell to. So think about things like language, right? I'm not saying you need to learn a foreign language. I'm saying have a think about what the different lingo is that maybe gets used over there, right? Maybe different spelling that gets used by customers in that region. Think about different preferences, or different holidays, for example, right? So, for example, there's a quite big holiday here in the UK. It's called Guy Fawkes Night in November. Would a T-shirt selling a Guy Fawkes design do well in the US? Probably not. You might get a few sales, but probably not. Exactly, right? What about July 4th, right? That's probably a bit more popular in the US, whereas again, the other way around, try selling a July 4th T-shirt in the UK, probably not going to get that much demand, right? So have a think about who your target audience actually is and adjust your way and your marketing approach according to that. So adjust the products that you're selling according to that. Adjust the tone of voice and your messaging. If you get someone reaching out to you, the customer service that you provide, adjust that to their regional kind of norms, values, expectations. It can go a long way. It's small things that you can do that can really go a long way to help to secure a sale, but also to have really happy customers that end up returning in the long run as well.
No, I think that's great advice. I hadn't even thought of that, since there are so many small intricacies between language, even if you both speak English, right? In the UK, I think you have the letter U, in a bunch more words than in the US, there's like little differences in spelling. Like I think gray is Grey or Gray, depending on where you live. Just like those little teeny things can make a big difference. Or calling a sweatshirt a jumper, I think, those little kinds of words. So if you are selling primarily in the US, it wouldn't hurt to really just do some research on what the types of words people in the US use in their listings and making sure that you're reflecting that. I do believe that the US is the largest market of buyers on Etsy. So I do think aiming your content a little bit more towards US buyers, unless you're making something for Guy Fawkes Night, then maybe obviously spell things in that type of way. So I think that's very, very good advice. It might take a minute to kind of catch on to some of those lingos and some of the little differences. But again, hopefully that comes up in your market research. So all really, really good points, Daniel. I really appreciate you joining me today. I think you're going to provide so much value to anyone who is watching this that lives anywhere, but especially in the UK and abroad in general. And so I really appreciate you joining me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your time, Cassie. It's been absolutely lovely speaking to you about all these great topics.
Yes, and again, I'll link Daniel's channel down in the description. So make sure to go subscribe and say hello to Daniel. And then thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you.